J. Stewart Blackton, D.W. Griffith, Sergei Eisenstein, Leni Riefenstahl, all in their own great and terrible ways demonstrated the growing power of the moving image to provoke powerful and often radical emotions. Images have power. Images can move minds. It can turn public attitudes on governments. It can shift international discourse. But can also be misused, weaponized to empower the vile and reactionary. Film may be truth at 24 frames a second, but if that is the case, then it only takes a few snips of celluloid to alter reality. The interpretation of art is by its very nature subjective. However, it's often the case, especially now, that we, each observer from our own distinct vantage point, treat our particular interpretation as objective fact. And while a work of art's meaning can shift with the changing of the culture that surrounds it, the actions taken by those inspired by their self-determined, objective interpretation often cannot be changed. They remain fixed points in time, creating undeniable consequences of a medium whose meaning can often never be described as undeniable. Sometimes it feels easy to draw that line. Surely J.D. Salinger never meant anyone to shoot a musician in cold blood when he penned his most famous book. Just the same, it feels fairly safe to dismiss the aforementioned Riefenstahl's claim that her work was purely documentary and not absolve her of her role in the Third Reich's machinery. But often, the question of intent in art is far murkier, and indeed the very question of whether intent outweighs impact has no clear answer. However, the mind is more powerful than the image. No one believes their own eyes as objective truth 24/7, and particularly at 24 frames a second. We greet images that don't meet our own perceptions with skepticism, those that do as affirmation of truth, and those that are abstract are often projected with whatever intentions we'd previously decided it had. And most powerful of all is the mind made to conjure its own images, to imagine the enemy in the dark, the monster in the closet, and the vilest intentions of those minds we do not know. John Ford knew that, which is why he repurposed German and Japanese propaganda films for his own prelude to war. Only by forcing Americans to confront those images could his efforts have any advantage over the audience's imagined perception that the enemy was either innocent or insurmountable. Images have power, but our own minds can conjure far more powerful images than any camera can capture. And as a result, while two people who look at the same abstract painting can walk away with two different ideas of the meaning behind each splash of red across an otherwise barren canvas, we so often hear debates between those who've never seen the painting, who talk wildly of how those splashes of paint obscure some idyllic landscape, or how the splashes of paint are sky blue or pine green. And in effect, it's those debates that give works of ignorance, or those otherwise innocuous or indeed inept, far more power than the act of actually looking ever could. I can't promise we will always be right, if anyone can be, nor to fully divorce ourselves from our own experiences, which so often affect interpretation. But I can promise that with every work on this list, we will not shy away. We will not stand outside the museum, sight unseen, and shout at stone walls. We will learn what we can from artists, peers, and scholars, and have as frank and honest a discussion as we can. And what we can do, what we can promise, is always to look.
Tomorrow is another day, but today we're discussing Gone with the Wind with special guests Lupita Mendez-Jones and Justin Jones.
Hi, everybody. We are joined this episode by Justin Jones and Lupita Mendez-Jones. They're two friends of mine I was happy to bring on. Justin Jones is a freelance entertainment writer. We all used to work together at a movie theater, and some of my favorite times, I worked downstairs with Justin, and Lupita worked upstairs, and Justin and I would argue about movies, as two people do when you put them in the same spot for long enough and their brains are equally broken. But the best times would be when Lupita would kind of sneak downstairs for a bit just to say hi, ask what we were talking about, and Justin would just go, "Oh, we're arguing about blank," and then you would watch as Lupita would be like checking her watch, being like, "Can I get away with this?" and then just like stick around to also argue a point. And it was so much fun. And so I knew when we were starting the show, I wanted both of you guys on. I hope you guys don't mind sharing an episode. I can promise you, down the line, if you guys want to, split and, somebody wants to take one and the other, you're welcome to. But I wanted to have you guys both on for this because I always enjoyed that interaction.
Oh, of course, it was in our wedding vows. Like whenever you do a podcast episode, I'd also do a podcast episode.
Or bonded for life.
Bonded for life.
I had asked you pretty early on if you guys wanted to come on, and I sent you the list of what we had available in this season. It was almost every film on there, and a couple of ones that were touchy. This was, I think, maybe shortly after all of the most recent conversations about the film in question, and so I wasn't sure who was going to pick what. And I was admittedly surprised that you guys volunteered for this one, given its status. So I'm excited to get into that and excited to hear why you guys picked that. So to kick this off, I'm going to read the National Film Registry statement as to why Gone with the Wind was inducted into the registry in the inaugural class. As one of the most popular and influential American films produced, Gone with the Wind remains possibly the definitive example of filmmaking in the Hollywood studio era. More than 7 decades after its release, David O. Selznick's production, coupled with Margaret Mitchell's best-selling story, still has the power to enthrall audiences. A rich score by Max Steiner and top performances from Vivien Leigh, Olivia de Havilland, Hattie McDaniel, and Clark Gable add to the film's indelibility. So that's what they had to say. Now, I'm curious, guys, without getting into too much of the meat and potatoes of it, what made you guys pick this film?
Well, Gods of Egypt wasn't available.
Okay, fair. Hasn't reached the 10-year requirement for the registry yet. Give it time.
Justin for sure did not want to do Gone with the Wind. I was the one really pushing it, because we also saw, Singing in the Rain and Snow White, and, one thing that Justin and Mike really bonded over at working at the movie theater was just, our love of Disney and, musicals. And we were like, oh, that's, a shoo-in. And I was like, well, both of us haven't really seen Gone with the Wind. I think it'd be really interesting for us to see it, to fill that hole in our movie history. And also, we're both from Texas. We need to. We just need to. Our perspective would be very interesting. You, as growing up as, a white man in Texas. Me, growing up, so, a Mexican-American in Texas. I just think it would be so interesting.
My favorite part about that is that when I messaged Justin shortly thereafter, he wrote back, and I believe the initial message made it sound like you guys were both immediately, this is what we want to do. Did not realize there was debate over that, which makes it all the more fun. I'm glad you picked it. The thing with this film, which we're going to get into, is there is so much to talk about with it, and not just in terms of the debate around it, but particularly the film itself. And I find one thing when we talk about movies is I have a particular belief, which is I'm welcome to somebody having an opinion on a film as long as they've seen it. And I feel like this is certainly one of those films that gets talked about more than it gets watched. And how much of that is because of just the insurmountable length of it, how much of that is because of various reputations, I don't know, but it's a weird kind of anomaly that sort of saturated the culture and was omnipresent until it wasn't. But I feel like for me growing up, it was part of the canon, and it was just a thing that we all knew. I mean, they were making Gone with the Wind Barbies, and they were, I remember seeing the however many it was, 4 VHS tape set in any house you went to. It was just a staple, the same way that Casablanca was, or Lawrence of Arabia was.
Right.
I feel like now, setting aside the debate about the depictions in it or the politics of it, it just is not part of the discourse the same way. And part of, or if it is, it sort of sits in the canon like this brick there that people are aware is there, and and kind of recognize or at least acknowledge that it is considered a great film, but don't actually watch it or engage with it or have any experience with it. I mean, you guys mentioned that you guys hadn't seen it. Tom, I know this was your first time watching it as well.
Yeah, first time for me too. Yeah, I don't know. It kind of doesn't feel like it hasn't left the conversation. I feel like, the context around the conversation's changed, but it feels like we're still always talking about this movie. Even when it wasn't, grown up a film lover, it's not a movie that that's never not in your consciousness. So I don't know. As for a movie that's taken such a, I don't know, right turn in how it's received, it's still just always talked about. It's always there.
I think that's fair. Allow me to rephrase it. I guess what I mean is that it was the kind of movie that every single person of our grandparents' generation saw and had a relationship with and a reference to, and pretty much every one of our parents' generation saw. And it no longer has a place of something that needs to be seen. It doesn't occupy the place, I guess, of, say, you know how we all, because we read it in school or what have you, we all know The Great Gatsby. We can all make references to The Great Gatsby. We all still get references to The Great Gatsby.
Yeah.
And I wonder if when people a little younger than us watch an old Looney Tunes or something and hear a reference to Tomorrow is Another Day or I'll Never Go Hungry Again, if they know what that is from the same way we do, where even if we hadn't seen the film, we picked up from osmosis, like, oh, these important moments from this movie or these pop culture references, or if it doesn't have that same cachet now.
So in Texas, I can't speak for like the whole rest of the Deep South, but in Texas, Gone with the Wind is still like revered.
Yeah.
We went to the University of Texas, and while among like college cultures there is sort of this desire to put up a bar between your enjoyment of this movie from your respect for it, pretty much everyone everywhere, this is like,
it's ingrained in the culture.
Yeah, I think Fathom Events or one of those places did a screening, and my whole family went and saw it. That was before I was going to the movies. I think it was when I was younger. But my whole family saw it, and it made it like a huge impact on them, and they loved it.
Particularly, like, and it's important to say, like, the women, especially in your family,
right?
Because like Justin's like family comes, especially like your mom's side, comes from this like Dallas socialite kind of society, like Deep South, like glamorous. So I think even though they may not be like Gone with the Wind's my favorite movie, it's like embedded in the culture, right?
Right. Yes, I would say it is a foundational text of Texan culture.
Yeah, it's almost part of identity.
Even though it's not Texan at all.
Yeah, it's Georgia.
Yeah, now, that's interesting you bring that up. If we could just, before we get into the film more in depth, given your background, could you give us a little more information on not just your background, regionally, but also what brought you guys to movies, and your interest in cinema? Because, Justin, you mentioned you weren't going to the movies back then. So what's that relationship?
I think it was just because I was a little baby boy. I'm the youngest of my siblings, so probably it was just my siblings were older than me. But the thing that really made me latch on to movies was actually deciding to watch every Best Picture nominee from every year with Lupita.
In high school.
And trying to figure out how to say that I didn't like a movie that was considered one of the best of the year. And then that just led me down the rabbit hole.
Yeah. For me, like, that was a big part of me, like liking movies that were like currently coming out. But I also had an older brother who was like 10 years older than me, who was like showing me movies I was probably way too young to see, but also showing me 12 Angry Men whenever I was in middle school. And like that, for some reason, clicking with me and being like, black and white movies are really interesting. Like, they are cool. Like, why is everybody not talking about this? Why are they only focused on like the Pokemon movie that's coming out on Cartoon Network?
Mike.
I did. No. He's right to call that out. I just did. It'll be out for months by the time this episode comes out. But I just did an episode of Podcast Like It's 1999 about Pokemon, the first movie, and in preparation,
you watched all of them.
I did. I watched all 24. I didn't have to do that.
Oh my gosh!
Mike's commitment to a bit is unparalleled.
It's I wish it was fully a bit, but it was kind of also a bit of like, I know, look, we're writers, we've dealt with comment sections before, and we've Justin and I have written for the same publication at one point, and we know how that comment section could be if you get one little detail wrong. So Nightmare. It's so ingrained in my brain of if I did not have the pull of Mewtwo reappears in The Adventure of Genesect or something, that somebody would come screaming at me. I also think this is the first time that Gone with the Wind and Pokemon the first movie are invoked in the same podcast. So I think we pulled something off.
I don't know.
there.
I mean, it makes sense. I mean, Pokemon's also about slavery.
It actually it is. No, it is. It is. Except that one has an uprising. But yeah. So and you guys are you're both from Texas originally?
Yeah,
Yes.
we both grew up in the Dallas.
In Irving.
In Irving, Texas.
Former home of the Dallas Cowboys.
That was not planned.
And you have moved, and obviously you guys have since moved to New York, where we are, right? Are you still there
Yes.
now, or did you?
Yes, we live in Bushwick still. We are here to stay.
Fantastic.
Yeah, our
Fantastic.
trajectory was growing up in Dallas, moved to Austin for college, stayed there for a year or two, and then found our way to Brooklyn.
In that regard, you've talked about the difference between the reception of Gone with the Wind here and there. Have you noticed, I mean, obviously, surely you've noticed differences in not just how we do things here, but I'm sure in how we sort of perceive and respond to history in compared from Brooklyn to Irving, right?
Yeah,
Right.
for sure.
I mean, I grew up in Irving, where I grew up. We went to a really, really diverse high school, and it was actually very progressive. But
Yeah.
I worked and hung out with a bunch of people that would go to these very, very segregated high schools in these very segregated parts of town. I had coworkers who had like Confederate flag wallets. And so in terms of reaction to history, I don't think you could make it to the subway stop with a Confederate flag wallet in Brooklyn. But in Irving, it's just, that's the thing that people do. That is how you honor the past. And frankly, I much prefer the fuck history attitude of Brooklyn. Can I cuss?
Yeah, please, by all
Yes.
means. I will say this. I think that what's so interesting, particularly about this film, in doing research for this, it is amazing how many takes you read that are so determined to find a particular attitude in this film or a particular point in this film, a particular message.
Mhm.
And if anything, while I have my read on the film, and I think we all have our reads on the film, this is a movie that is near impossible to definitively say this is what it's saying, and not just because it was any abstract intentions, but rather you come from a book, Margaret Mitchell's book, that has a very definitive point of view. But then David O. Selznick takes the book and he decides he's going to change things from the novel. He starts out saying that his intention is that he wants to make sure that no people of color are offended by the film. And he starts talking to Walter White of the NAACP. And that's the story that you hear from some people when you read it is, Selznick was in communication with Walter White of the NAACP. But when you dig into it, there's also that element of some of the advice he got from the NAACP, he took under advisement and went, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And then other times when they said something he didn't want to do, he just went, you know what, never mind, I'm just going to keep doing it. So it's not as cut and dry there. But then you have a film that George Cukor is directing originally and comes from the vantage point of one of the few fairly openly gay directors in Hollywood of the time. And I know that Olivia de Havilland and Vivian Leigh loved working with him because he was very focused on the woman's part of the story.
Mhm.
And then he is replaced midway through for reasons that no one has properly nailed down by Victor Fleming, who is very much a man's man director, that Clark Gable wanted. And he makes Rhett more of the focal point of the film. And then by that point, after a while, a third director comes in and Selznick was directing some scenes himself. And so by the end, cinema is always a collection of points of view. The auteur theory kind of ignores the fact that so many other people have input, but particularly this film is coming from so many different vantage points and so many different, I think, stances on the very conflict the film is based on. A very hard movie to ascribe a singular intent on, particularly when it comes to, I think, what George Cukor wanted the film to say, and then what Victor Fleming wanted the film to say.
Release the Cukor cut? Is that anything?
It is HBO Max, so, but yeah, it is. I think that's interesting to me that we have, I think that's part of the thing with this movie. And there are, I was starting to say that recently a screening of Kindergarten Cop was canceled. And the person who canceled the screening said, you could say it's just a movie. In regard to the completely justified reevaluation we are all having about the depiction of police and law enforcement in film and television, which is a real discussion that is not only necessary but justified. But in reaction to that, this person canceled a Kindergarten Cop screening, and when pressed on it, they said, you could say it's just a movie, but you could say that Birth of a Nation is just a movie, or Gone with the Wind is just a movie. And I felt like that sentence to me indicated, I'm not sure you've seen either of the films you're referencing.
Right.
Yeah.
In part
the one
because...
you canceled.
Yeah, because to me, like, it comes down obviously to a question of, does intention matter when it comes to, the impact of a work of art? But I do think there is a difference between a movie like Gone with the Wind that is hard to pin down and I think at the very least irresponsible in the images it depicts versus something like Birth of a Nation, which we'll have to cover in a couple seasons, which is a movie that is undeniably designed with hate and designed to convey a very particular message of hate and intolerance. And I think that it is important to discuss this film, Gone with the Wind, and how difficult it is to kind of ascribe a singular viewpoint in rather than write it off by what we've decided that the film is about, I think. Because I'm certain that it's possible that we each have different takes on different scenes in this thing. It's a hard one to wrap your head around in a lot of ways.
What makes Gone with the Wind so hard to grapple with as a film, because of course it is disgustingly racist, it is so misogynistic, it paints like they want you to think Scarlett O'Hara is this huge feminist whenever she really is just kind of a whiny little brat. But the movie itself is just so, production wise, it's just so beautiful. You halfway through we were like, why do we care about what they're talking about? It's because the performances are just so great. And that, I think Gone with the Wind does something really good where Birth of a Nation lacks, right? And that's why we're so easy to dismiss Birth of a Nation. But Gone with the Wind, we're just but it's Gone with the Wind.
Well, it's just funny because Selznick didn't want this to become another Birth of a Nation. A lot of the decisions that were made on this movie to try to not be Birth of a Nation were, smart. You don't want to be a movie that helps bring back the KKK and lead to a history of hatred we're still dealing with today.
Oops.
But, yeah, whoopsie, DW. You...
Slap on the wrist for you.
Drop the ball on that one.
Yeah, bite my thumb at you. I think some of the decisions they made trying not to be Birth of a Nation actually ended up hurting it because it leads to a lack of clarity in what it's trying to say that could lead people to have bad faith arguments about this movie. For example, he didn't want the KKK to be an element in the movie at all, which it is in the book, and which is kind of hinted at in the movie after Scarlett gets attacked, and Ashley and Frank go and attack those damn fucking hillbillies in the woods. Subtly hinting at they're kind of starting some KKK shit, but not really getting to it. So maybe a little more clarity about what you don't want this to be, or maybe deal actually deeper into the darkness inherent in the story and location you're telling. So yeah, I think that's one of the many reasons why there's some hinky stuff in this movie.
I think it's interesting to actually compare this to Birth of a Nation, especially with regard to the way Birth of a Nation sort of repopularized the KKK, and in that a lot has been written in how Gone with the Wind repopularized plantation culture, and especially architecture in the South at fancy institutions, at universities, is very, very designed to evoke the fanciness that Gone with the Wind embodies throughout these all-day barbecues and pillars and Greek-ish, but also very Southern buildings, and how Gone with the Wind sort of inadvertently led to that.
But I also think it's a weird thing with this movie sometimes, where to me, some of the things, and that's of course my vantage point as a lifelong metropolitan northerner, I'm sure, but there are things in this movie that I feel are fairly explicit in their criticisms of that Southern culture that I feel like people kind of miss. You know, when you show what some people talk about as this idyllic shot of all the women napping, you cut from and let me see, I have the quote here, but you cut from a plaque at Tara. You have a plaque that says, "Oh, do not waste time. It is the stuff life is made of." And then immediately cut to all of these debutantes napping, just literally wasting time while enslaved children fan them. And like, I don't understand, to me, how you can go from one image to the other, unless you're willfully trying to ignore it, go from one image to another and not see that as critical of the very thing it's depicting.
It is hard because, like, it's hard seeing it in the context of 2020 and being like, oh, this movie's really good because it knows it's like, it's because you kind of view it as like ironic, right? And you're like, oh, this movie's great. And then you get to the point where you're like, no, they really mean what they're trying to say. And that's not okay.
I wonder if it does, because here's my thing, is that I feel like in the first half of the film, I feel like Rhett Butler exists, and this is the one thing I struggled with a bit. Rhett Butler exists very clearly to criticize these people and to criticize the entire plantation culture. He shows up, and when all of these, in my notes, I believe brandy drunk dipshits is the term I chose, are all talking about how easily they're going to win. And they're going to win because it doesn't matter what the North does. They have Southern values. And he says, all you've got is cotton, slaves, and arrogance. And then later, you know, that famous shot of all the wounded on the battlefield, or in the streets, I should say, all the wounded there. And then it pans from the wounded up to the tattered Confederate flag. If you just isolate that scene, then it is a moment that is very open to interpretation, whether you want to read it the way that many people do, which is, the tragedy of the loss of the Old South, or the way that I always read it, which is, look at how many people died for this stupid flag. And that's always how I read it. But then if you watch the next scene, when they're looking at the list of the dead, Rhett rides up on his horse and goes, dying, the cause of what? Staying stuck in the past, refusing to move forward, clinging to stupid, and he rips this idea apart. So I think that once you have that follow-up scene, I think it can't help but give you a sense of why that shot goes to that flag. Where I get thrown, however, is at the end of Act 1, where after spending the whole week.
Sorry, go.
No, and so that's the thing. I wrestled with that. I watched it with my significant other, and I said, like, this is the one thing that troubles my interpretation. And I understand that part of the problem is, of course, you have to follow the beats of the book, and you eventually have to get Rhett Butler in jail. And I wonder if that was something that Fleming influenced the heroism of that speech. And I struggled with why this character, who up until now has represented a criticism of Southern values, would enlist. And the only interpretation I could find was that I think what the burning of Atlanta scene asks us to do, given that the film otherwise has been so critical of the hypocritical South. And I think inarguably, I mean, there are so many points where you would have to believe that the people making this movie were absolutely brain dead to not recognize the irony of having a woman at this big gala describe women auctioning off dances as a slave auction and objecting to it when she owns literal slaves. Like, you would have to assume these people that hundreds of people were bereft of any sense of irony to not think that intentional.
Mm-hmm.
But when it comes to Rhett joining the cause, the only thing that I could take from that still fits what I feel the rest of the film was saying was that the movie is essentially asking us to simultaneously reckon with the fact that the South was backwards and evil, in its perpetuation of America's original sin, and deserved to be defeated in the war, and also acknowledge that Sherman's tactics of burning down essentially whole cities and full economic and cultural ruin was also extreme. it asks you, I think, in that moment to have to kind of reconcile with both those things. That Red is basically looking at the burning of Atlanta and seeing an entire city torched to the ground, and people just being what will eventually be starved and run out, and looking at that and saying, I don't agree with this, but this is a bridge too far. And I think that is if that's what the film is trying to do, and it's certainly not the first, that's a difficult thing to ask of audiences. I mean, you saw the same thing. I think about Clint Eastwood's double feature of Flags of Our Fathers and Letters from Iwo Jima, and how even when those came out, Iwo Jima got the Best Picture, but I remember people being kind of conflicted about that because Clint Eastwood was the kind of director, despite his personal politics aside, he was asking you to simultaneously accept that the Japanese were on the wrong side of World War II. They were part of the Axis powers. They're committing atrocities. And also, we probably shouldn't have dropped those bombs on them because that was a crime. And I think that's a difficult needle to thread.
Well, that's again another one of those things where the movie undercuts itself that I really I was thrown by, and I understand why they were doing it, which is because Scarlet is supposed to be the personification of the South. They're like doing this thing where he says earlier, well, I guess I'm just a big lover of lost causes. Sort of like he's gonna keep fighting for Scarlet even though she doesn't want him, and he's gonna go back and try to fight and help this lost cause that he loves so much, even though he knows it's fucked up, kind of hinting at what his life is going to be like for 12 years dealing with this absolute asshole. I don't think it's a good idea, because I think, it's not the exact one-to-one comparison that it needs to be for it to work symbolically. It does kind of make Rhett a little more less likable. He's more cognizant of what the South is doing, and he still fights for it. And it's just one of those things that I don't think really worked. Maybe there was a better way to get him away from her without him, fighting a lost cause for slavery, and which also was kind of funny too, having never seen it and hearing people speak so clearly and so definitively that this movie is like pro-Confederacy and pro-slavery. I was really kind of surprised that in the scene where they're at the party and all the men are talking, oh, we're going to go to war because we have Southern values, that they just straight up say, we're doing it because they don't want us to have slaves anymore. There's none of this like modern day shit we deal with. Oh, it's about states' rights. They were just straight up like, look, they even not even Rhett, just them. Oh, they're trying to take our slaves. This is unconscionable. And oh shit. Even Gone with the Wind was saying, no, they were fighting for slavery.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one thing about this movie, and it makes me think about another 1939 film, which is Jean Renoir's Rules of the Game. The Rules of the Game was a movie that I remember watching for the first time when I was in early high school, just because my library had it. And I was like, this sucks. It's just a bunch of rich people being assholes. What's the point? And then of course you get older and you come to recognize that this is essentially, and I've invoked Rules of the Game before, I think on Singing in the Rain too, but because it's just this perfect encapsulation of how frivolous and ignorant these people are right before it all falls apart, and the arrogance and smugness before it all comes crumbling down. And to me, what I think is frustrating about Gone with the Wind is how lost that element has become over time. People read this film as just a eulogy for the Old South, and it's certainly taken on that flavor over the years. And I'm sure that part of that depends on one's geographic place of origin when they watch it. But to me, it, like Tom mentions that scene of them all sitting around with the brandy, and there's so many moments. You look at the fact that the women who are the focus of this film, all they do is nap and wear dresses, and that's it. And it's such a frozen in time, miserably austere existence.
Well, nobody works in the first half of until the war starts. You don't see all the men just talk about how great they are and how great their lives are and how great the South is. You don't see them do shit. They do, compare and contrast and do with like, oh, look at all these white guys talking, and then here's a shot of a black person actually doing the work. and then the war happens, and you see how completely unprepared these people, these lily white spoiled dipshits, are to do anything other than talk.
I mean, I think that, yeah, the film to me, I'm always confused, and Justin Lupita, I hope you can speak to this, being from the South and having that vantage point. It's always confused me that the film has been taken as a sincere eulogy for the Old South, when, to me, the representation of the Old South and Southern values is Ashley Wilkes, the Leslie Howard character, who, from the minute you see him, I remember that when my partner and I were watching it, and you hear in the opening scene all this hype about Ashley, and then you finally meet him, and she just goes, "Him? Like, why?" Very Arrested Development, him. And then what's interesting is all of the Southern guys in the film, and Cukor had to intend this, which is that all of the Southern gentlemen are all very washed out. It's not just that they're polished, but makeup-wise, complexion-wise, very washed out and very drab. And the minute Clark Gable shows up on screen, he pops. Every other gentleman you see in the film is typically like when you watch a lot of older movies, especially from like the 20s and the 10s, where it's like, oh, he's the most handsome gentleman, and they're the blandest looking sons of bitches. But then you bring in Clark Gable, and he is undeniably sexy, and not just by 1939 standards. Like, even now, you look at him, and yeah, he's got large ears, but beyond that, you're like, okay, I get it. And that contrast has to be intentional. And I think the fact that Ashley is so useless in the film,
he's a beta cuck.
He's so, yeah, and like, yes, to Tom's point, like, I think that's intentional, that he is so wishy-washy.
I mean, look at the husband she runs through before she finally gets to Rhett. They're all just these lily white, just nothing men who get cut down in the most ridiculous ways possible. Even her father. Like, I laughed at this scene, I guess because I'm just an asshole, but like when her father chases the guys away from the house and he gets thrown through a fence, that's just like, yeah, that's what these Southern idiots, this is how they would die, these dandy idiots. They can't even fall off a horse without just leaving this mortal coil. They're all kind of useless.
And I'll make this quick point, and then Justin Lupita, I want you to touch on that, interpretation. But
oh, that's right, we have guests.
We do. But one of the things I actually really love about Scarlett's character, or the makeup of Scarlett's character, is the fact that this movie, there's this weird read, and I guess if you're half paying attention, like, you could read it as Scarlett is from this old Southern family, like this rich history. And she's like, oh, we can't abandon Tara, as though Tara had been in their family for generations. And if you haven't watched the movie in a while, I think you remember it that way, that it's this old family home, that it's like the ranch in Streetcar Named Desire, another Vivien Leigh film. But no, her father is Irish. He won he won the land in a poker game. This is not some rich familial estate. They're Irish. And he is blatantly Irish. And even the name Tara is just named after the Hills of Tara in Ireland. There's nothing, I guess, there's nothing even, quote, authentically Southern about Tara. It is not an organically Southern idea. And yet they're responding to it as though it was something that had been there since the dawn of America, and I think that that's such an important element of that character, and how kind of fake the clinging to the old ways feels. But again, that's coming from our vantage point as lifelong Northerners looking at this and seeing it as critical. And I'm wondering, where you think that other read comes from, of the more sincere, glory of the Old South kind of vibe that this film takes on for people.
One of the things I quickly thought about is whenever you're talking about like how quick they are to call Tara home, and they're quick to make it like this big grand thing that they need to save. That's very much like Southern culture.
That is the South.
Like, we love just making just this, like, just insignificant things part of like tradition, and like making it like just like what was I gonna say? Just like increase their value, basically.
Once you call something a tradition, it's like it's been there forever.
Yeah, and like there's a joke at one of the colleges in Texas. It's like, oh, if an Aggie does something, then it's going to be a tradition.
They're going to do it every year and make a T-shirt out of it.
Yeah, and it's just like, that's just how it is.
Like it's Texas A&M, and so the joke is how many Aggies does it take to screw in a light bulb? And it's 3. 1 to screw it in, 1 to make it a yearly tradition, and 1 to make a T-shirt. That is like the thing. Once it's yours, it is proudly Southern. One thing that this movie actually reminded me of is, have y'all seen Michael Bay's Six Underground on Netflix?
Oh, have I seen Michael Bay's Six Underground? Yes, I have seen. Of course, I have seen.
I have not, but
the masterpiece of Bayhem.
So Ryan Reynolds is this main character. He's this very Tony Stark, Bruce Wayne type. He's a billionaire who sees injustice and decides to take the law into his own hands. And to me, the whole time, it read as this very tongue-in-cheek criticism of superhero movies and of like how fascist they can be. And throughout it, I was like, okay, Michael Bay, he's back on his pain and gain horse. And then in the third act, Ryan Reynolds' billionaire character learns his lesson, and it's that he doesn't care about his team enough. And the big heroic climax is he goes back for one of his teammates. I was completely wrong. I was reading way more into it than I actually think Michael Bay intended. Don't get me wrong, that movie slaps and it has some of the best action set pieces I've seen in a very long time. But I felt blindsided by this third act climax that didn't live up to the movie I was expecting. And when Rhett is like, I feel bad for having not been there to stand with my brothers or whatever he does at the end of that first act, and he finally enlists it, I almost felt betrayed.
Yeah, because like throughout the first act, he was saying all these things that we've been saying about Texas and about the South, and we were like, yes, Rhett, is he going to be my new favorite character? This is great.
Who is this Han Solo motherfucker just slipping in, shitting on the Confederacy?
And then he just broke our hearts. And I think like whenever he does that, my interpretation of it, you can let go of the South, but the South isn't going to let go of you, you know? Like, people who are from the South will gladly tell you they're from the South, and it's like a badge they wear with pride, which, like, we kind of also do it in our own, like, in our own way, you know? Like, it's always going to be home, and I think that's just so apparent in people.
I think a tough thing to do with this movie, and I want to bring up one particular thing that bothered me, and we can get into it more later, but, you know, a lot of things that I read when looking this film up were interpretations based on taking a scene in a vacuum, speaking about a particular image or a particular moment, abstract of context. And in fact, there was one article I read that really irked me, not because of their interpretation, but because of the way they phrased it, which is, and we'll touch on this more later, but they were discussing the somewhat infamous staircase scene, which has a lot of baggage to it, and a lot of baggage that's been brought to it over time, and it, you know, various vantage points to that. But what they were talking about was, they said, you know, and Rhett picks her up drunk and brings her up the stairs as she tries to fight him off. And then they said, and then the next scene shows her in bed smiling to suggest that it was all consensual. But if you take away that scene, the staircase scene is open to interpretation. And I looked at that and went, okay, but you just essentially said, sure, the next scene gives an answer, but what if we ignore that? What could this mean? Which is like, I have absolutely no problem with multiple interpretations of art. Art is open to many interpretations, but movies give you information in different sequences. They depict things in a certain order to try and convey something, and I think that to look at, and this is a movie that happens to a lot, which is to pull one scene out of context and look at it and say, look at this, though. What do you think this means? Without looking at the rest of what's going on, leaves it open to a lot more sort of bad faith reads or being employed in a way to convey a particular point of view. I think about when we talk about Rhett's shift and his decision to go fight for the South, while that's troubling and we all, I think, stumbled over that, Lupita, you said something I thought was interesting about you can't let the South go. And I think that the struggle that Rhett has in this movie is not even about letting the South go, it's about letting Scarlett go. And in that moment, when he's driving her away in the carriage, he has the opportunity to cut her out of his life completely. But he can't move on from her. And because he goes back to her, even though he shouldn't, the story punishes him for it quite clearly. It is not a story that ends happily by any means. He marries Scarlett eventually, gets her to marry him, tries to have a happy life, and she has no interest in him. She's pining for Ashley. They have a child, and the child dies. She gets pregnant and loses the baby. He is very much in a Greek tragedy way punished for his decisions. And I think that there is certainly a parallel too of the idea of that his decision to go back, whether to the war or to her, is kind of karmically returned to him in tragedy. That you cannot go back home. You cannot restore this. That the passage of time is going to win. That all of this will be titularly gone with the wind. That there's no way to fight this.
That's why I said, it makes a thematic sense. I just, it just feels like character-wise, it's kind of not working the way it needs to. It's working more on the metaphorical than on the character level. And, I get it. A good ending can help recontextualize a lot of stuff, which I do think this movie does. I think it's very much clear that Scarlett's, I'm going to get Rhett back. I'm going to rebuild Tara, and I'm going to get Rhett back. And it's just her alone in the silhouette up against in front of Tara. Tara's behind her. If she's supposed to represent the South, we know she's not going to get Rhett back. This is just a delusion. She's sticking to an old South way, and she's going to be alone in her old, hateful, selfish, myopic life. And, you see that, and it kind of, for me, it recontextualizes everything. But there's some stuff that works more metaphorically than it does character-wise, and it's similar to the marital rape scene. I get it, even, more so than the Rhett going back thing. But, again, metaphorically, the South really just needs to needs to be progressive, and it'll actually be happy, but it just can't do it. But it's kind of odd when you look at the whole characters arcs of everything.
All right. Well, with me bringing up, Tom bringing up, are we? I've got some thoughts there. Are we all ready to dive into the staircase scene? Are we ready to take that detour? Because I'll take that detour if we want to take that detour.
Can I throw my hat into the ring on Rhett's sort of on
Please do.
Mike's
Please,
interpretation
yes.
of the Greek tragedy? To me, the cause and effect of sort of the fallout came from the way they treated each other. And also, I totally hear y'all in how that first act depicts the Southerners as inbred fancy assholes. But to me, watching that, I actually did not pick up a whole lot of irony. To me, it felt like, can you believe this asshole Rhett? He doesn't believe in the cause. He's not on our side. We got to get him on our side. And he is heroic, unabashedly. To me, that was my reading. My interpretation on that was this is what life used to be. It was destroyed, and our favorite rogue finally gave in and saw the cause.
I think the thing that makes the greatest argument for what you're suggesting is not the movie itself, but the fact that now in our modern day, I feel like you can't help but watch Rhett Butler and recognize that he is the bulk of the DNA of Han Solo,
right?
Which is the film we just talked about, and also to a degree Lando, because the first time you see him in Act 2, when he's sitting there playing cards with that jacket draped around him, it's 100%. And of course with Han Solo, it's the idea that he's dismissive of the cause and dismissive of the Force, but then he swings back around with his Millennium Falcon anyway.
Right.
But that said, I do think there's something so fascinating about Rhett insofar as the movie never, to me, feels like it's saying he deserves scorn or deserves what he gets to him. He's an effective character. But let's touch on we'll touch on the staircase scene. I was also thinking about when you said that, Justin, about that you didn't sense irony there. It's always a matter of what we bring to it, and of course what we know, what we come with. What I find so interesting is I watched on the DVD they had this footage of the opening of the film in Atlanta, And what is so interesting to me, in a way, is that almost no one who worked on this film in a prominent role was from the South. And you feel that when they're like, we're opening a film in Atlanta, and here to give a speech is Vivian Leigh. And you kind of feel, I mean, she was aloof anyway, but you feel in her vibe just, oh, I'm so glad to be here in this lovely place. And even, even Gable wanted that role or took that role because it was a cool guy, action hero, swashbuckling-y role. Like, I don't think, truly, to me, I do not think anybody... This is me going more subjective, of course, and putting my own interpretation on it, but just from what I've read, I don't think anybody gave a shit about the old glory of the South, at least in the initial crew of Selznick and Cukor and Lee and Gable and de Havilland. I think that Selznick clearly just saw that the book was a massive, undeniable hit and wanted it, and like we touched on at the beginning, he was conscious of the fact that he stated that he did not want the film to do to people of color what, or, and to African Americans, what Hitler's films were doing to Jews in Germany at the time, being Jewish. And of course, that's complicated by the fact that, like I said, he was in touch with the NAACP, he was in touch with Walter White on that, and Walter White suggested, we can send you a representative on set, a black representative who can talk about the sensitivity issues in this film. And Selznick was like, we got somebody, he'll do it. And Walter White objected to that because he felt like an African-American who worked in the studio system would just be saying what they wanted to hear. And I think that it becomes complicated. I think that the other issue that we have with this film is trying to interpret, we are forced to interpret it through a modern lens. And I think that obscures some things. I think that we're missing some pieces of the decoder ring. I know that when I watched it with my partner and we were discussing the staircase scene, which she had overheard me talking about with a friend of ours who will be on for a future episode about the staircase scene and this article that bothered me about the staircase scene. And then we watched it and she turned around and said, this was not at all what I was picturing. Like, she was picturing something that was just so brutal, and Scarlett was flailing and screaming, and she went, this is, good or not, like, this is in so many romance novels. Like, this is a staple, that scene is a staple of that bodice ripper romance novel, and even more so in the 30s. And I was thinking about the fact that, and this is not to justify anything one way or the other, but I was thinking about the fact that the scene also feels a lot different if you think about it as a scene being directed by a man or a scene that was written in a novel by a female author. And how I think about the fact that there's a very similar scene in, of all things, Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged. And it's a power dynamic, and it is set up as this scene where she and the book is more explicit about the fact that Scarlett demands attention and she wants men to literally be tearing down the door just to get her to look at them. And it makes this out to be a bit more of a game and a bit more of a romantic thing. And I think that part of the issue is, of course, trying to interpret the film through a modern lens. And I also think that there's an element of that, quite frankly, discussions of consent is very prominent in the media now, and something that we need to be having that conversation, and having a piece of media that might require more nuance to its interpretation. You got to kind of do the cost analysis of, is it worth getting into the gray area on this, or should we just get into the fact that, like, no one should do this?
It's like I was saying before, like, metaphorically it works. And even for me, I'm thinking, okay, this is made in 1939. It's set in the 1860s for the most part, 1870s towards the end. And, oh, by the way, we're further away from Gone with the Wind than Gone with the Wind was to the Civil War. How's that?
Oh, God.
So, like, I'm thinking, okay, this sexual relationship, the sexual dynamic wouldn't be out of place in this time, in this story. Yeah, if you're making this thing now, you change it, or you don't even attempt to do it, because now we just don't even want to have the conversation that maybe relationships have fucked up moments, or things aren't always good or bad, or right or wrong. You understand where they're going metaphorically. I get it. The theme, I get it. Like a lot with this movie, it's really complicating things in a way that it's not doing itself any favors 80 years later.
I'd actually push back on media today not wanting to have that conversation. I mean, Game of Thrones did it a lot, right?
Yeah.
Well, they also weren't willing to actually have the conversation. They just do it and say, Oh, but it's
Okay.
medieval times.
Never mind. I shouldn't have brought up Game of Thrones. I don't want to get into it.
No,
I take it back.
but
I
it's
retract.
interesting. No, but can I leap on that for a second? Because you know what the thing is, I did think of when my partner and I were discussing this scene in this film, and she was talking about romance novels, and it made me think of obviously this weird thing that we had, that at the same time that we were starting to have a really very important conversation on consent in this country, 50 Shades of Grey was a huge hit, and they made the movies. And you had a lot of conversation from people in the BDSM community saying this doesn't represent it properly. Basically saying we don't want people to see this film and get the wrong idea. And I think that the one thing when we talk about media today is I can't help but feel, and we've been watching a lot of older films for this, and I've been watching a bunch in addition to that as kind of extracurricular reading for this. And the one thing you kind of discover is that it feels like older films seem to have more faith in their audience to draw a conclusion, to interpret things. And I feel like now with film, we have, if a movie does not directly say what its issues are and where it stands on something, people will assume the worst if they want to, and will very often look for the worst and look for something. I think about the fact that I remember having a conversation with someone about, and here's a movie I didn't like, but this past year, Jojo Rabbit, and people saying, I'm just worried that people are going to watch this and take like a pro-Nazi message from it. And I kind of thought, I have a lot of problems with Jojo Rabbit. I think you'd be hard-pressed to look at that movie and say, I mean, you could argue that it minimizes the Holocaust. You could argue a number of different things about how it handles its subject, but you'd be hard-pressed, unless you're looking for it, to say that movie is pro-Nazi. Like Tom talks about it not being successful in what it does, and sometimes being more metaphorical, but not working from a character perspective. And I agree with that. I also think that there's an element of, I don't want to suggest that we have more or less media literacy now than before, but I think that the prism through which we view cinema has certainly changed over the last 40, 50, 60 years.
So I have thoughts on what Mike said, but I think Lupita wanted to share her perspective on that stairway sequence before we slip too far away from that.
Yeah. I think what's so important to see about that, and even just looking at the movie as a whole, like we have been talking a lot about Rhett and all that, but like it's like Scarlett's story. Like she's like the main character of it. In that stairway scene, like from the get-go, her intention. She just wants to take a fucking drink of whiskey. She wants to relax. She's stressed because of all these Yankees. And then Rhett is over here just being like, just like being obnoxious and not letting her just enjoy herself. And then like he just takes her and grabs her and like goes up the staircase. And I think what to tie it back to like romance novels, it's really in the perspective of women where we're reading like this scene. And from the beginning, I knew where, I hadn't heard of this scene that much, so I didn't know where it was going. But from like their vibe interacting, I was like, oh, like I now know where it's going. And Justin had no idea, even when the scene had ended, like that she was maritally raped. And I was like, no, it's so clear. It's so clear. He's like, yeah, but like that's not what it's like. She gave in. She's smiling. It's like, but it's just so different. So I'm sure like back then this was kind of like a like steamy scene, and all of those like white women got hot and heavy for Rhett and like take me into your arms. But at the same time, I'm sure there were other women that were like, I don't want my husband to ever really do that to me.
And it reminded me actually quite a bit of a conversation that Lupita and I have had before about Rocky. And in Rocky, when he first kisses Adrian, she's like, no, and he kisses her. And I honestly have no idea if that is presented critically in Rocky. I go back and forth on it. And that's like 40 years after Gone with the Wind, and they're still sort of having these same conversations on how that relationship is shown on screen and whether it's sexy for the man to do that or not.
I mean, we're still dealing with that now, and I think that that's because, not to get too much into the weeds with this, but one thing that we're having trouble, I think, today dealing with when we talk about things, particularly things of this kind, is the fact that human sexuality is very complicated. I think about it from the angle of there's so many different things to that, but like it is this thing where it's very, and the fact that recently I saw a discussion where somebody turned around and was talking about the Vladimir Nabokov novel Lolita, and you could obviously suggest that there are people who read that and just see it as surface level and are creeps as a result, but there's also an element of that novel is very much going out of its way to say something can be really well made and also toxic. That is the point of that novel. And people are kind of not able to go that far with it because they're looking at it and kind of drawing very definitive lines of what is good and what is bad. And it becomes very difficult, I think, to sort of legislate and draw definitive lines of what is or isn't acceptable when it comes to relationships and human sexuality, because we can't help it. We all kind of measure it by what we personally do or don't want and what we personally do or don't like. And I can't, with any romantic film, with any romance in cinema, it becomes very hard to not put that on that. I mean, there were so many movies, like you talked about, Justin, with the, them saying no at first and then they kiss. It happens constantly in film because it is one of the key elements of, one of the key cliches of the romance genre. And the weird thing about it is, if you're watching a movie and you're actually vibing with the couple and you want to see them get together and you buy their chemistry, that scene happens and you let it just run by. But if it's a movie where you're not on board for that couple, you immediately step back and go, oh, this is messed up. This is wrong. And I think it is a challenging thing for us to kind of watch those moments. And this film is riddled with that. This film, not just from the relationship perspective, it is a movie that presents us with so many moments and images that we kind of have to not just take in the context of its time. I don't want to put it just as that, but to accept that there can be different interpretations than just our knee-jerk reaction to things. Again, we talk about the tattered Confederate flag. And look, my knee-jerk reaction when I see a Confederate flag is just to go, oh, Jesus. Especially because of what it is now. And especially because of what it has come to represent now, which is this real nostalgic sense of things were better in the good old days. Especially how it's used in certain films. You look at a lot of films that deal with, South and the Civil War. A lot of times it is you were supposed to see that flag and go, oh man, what a fuck up. Or even just look at it and go, God, remember that time when half the country split? The country murdered each other and then just tried to get back together and pretend it didn't happen? That was rough. Because that's the other element that Gone with the Wind, the entire Act 2 of Gone with the Wind deals with, which is the idea and, of course, the concept of Reconstruction and how we view Reconstruction as a success or a failure is a can of fucking worms. But at least the movie's vantage point to me does seem to suggest this idea of like, yeah, what do you do after the war? You have obliterated the enemy, and now you're like, good, you're part of the country again. Let's see how that goes. It is easy to look at that and perhaps see it as totally critical of the North because the Yankees want more taxes. But I think that there's more to it than that. I think that with a lot of this, it is, again, it's a hard thing to pin down. And I don't think that in a particular place that we are as a culture, where we are in a seismic time, and rightly so, where we are trying to rewrite the rules of what is or isn't acceptable. The same way that if you look at the 1960s and the conversations about, well, why is it that we do this way? Why is it that we believe this thing? I think that we are in a time now where we're trying to redefine that, but that also makes things that are more ambiguous or more gray areas.
This is something that I sort of generally struggle with, that Gone with the Wind made me think of, especially with the degree to which it presents itself as critical of the Confederacy and its ills. But to what degree is art guilty for the people who misunderstand it? Because when people come out like Fight Club is my shit, bro, I'm gonna beat up some assholes because I'm Fight Club, first rule of Fight Club. Or they're like, Jordan Belfort, he's a legend of the game. That's why I got into finance in the first place. People like that are everywhere. They might outnumber the people who actually get Fight Club and The Wolf of Wall Street. And to what degree is Fight Club and The Wolf of Wall Street sort of culpable for the people that they make?
Well, it's interesting you say that. When I was writing out how we're going to introduce this episode, which by now people might have heard, I was thinking about that and the fact that that's a hard thing to answer because, of course, there's a question of does intent matter when it comes to impact? And the fact that art, when we talk about it academically, obviously art is open to interpretation and all interpretation is healthy and discussion is healthy. But when a particular interpretation of a particular work of art has real world consequences, those are inarguable. So, for example, if somebody watches a movie that we're discussing and one of us suggests is pro-Confederacy and the other suggests is anti-Confederacy, and if somebody watches that movie and then goes out and I don't know, burns down somebody's house and plants a Confederate flag on the lawn, well, inarguably that's an effect of the art. But how much of that do we attach to the artist? I mean, sometimes it's easy. I don't think any of us are going to suggest, in all seriousness, I have to specify that because I know Tom, I don't think any of us are going to suggest that J.D. Salinger is responsible for the death of John Lennon just because Mark David Chapman read Catcher in the Rye before he shot him. At the same time, and I'm repeating myself a bit, but at the same time, we're going to hold Lenny Riefenstahl accountable.
Right.
Yeah.
In most cases, though, it becomes more difficult. And I struggle with that a lot because I think that now, as an artist and as a writer, you have an obligation. It's necessary to make sure that your point is clear, to avoid misinterpretation, because of the effects it might have, which is something that I struggled with in preparation for this. I mean, we had, you guys agreed to do this movie months ago, and I moved the recording to now so that I had the time to read up and do things because I'm so afraid of saying something, even now on this podcast with who knows what size audience we have, saying something that could be used, or taken the wrong way and used to justify something that I don't believe in. At the same time, I think it is a lot more difficult, especially when it comes to older art, for an artist to ask an artist to not only create something that conveys a message for their time that people understand in their time, but to somehow anticipate what the future is going to look like and what circumstances will have. I mean, we talk a lot about intention, not to get too political here, but when we talk about something like the Second Amendment, everybody acknowledges that the founding fathers were thinking of muskets and militias and not AR-15s in cities. But that exists now and has been misused and misinterpreted in many ways. So I guess it's kind of a question, especially with these older films. Even so now to some degree, but especially with these older films, the question of how responsible are they? And I also think, if I may, and I hope I'm not rambling too much, Justin, to your point, but I think it also depends on what we want to think of the movie itself, because I know plenty of people, and I'm not going to call anybody out, I'm not going to name names, but I know plenty of people, I think Tom and I both did, Justin, you knew too, people who are the kind of people where if you walked up to them and said, is a movie responsible for an audience's interpretation or misinterpretation, who would go, absolutely not. And if you walked up to them and said, is Christopher Nolan responsible for the Aurora shooting? They would say, absolutely not. And they were the same people that went, I'm pretty sure the Joker's going to cause riots. That movie's irresponsible. Mm. And where did that come from? Well, that came from, in part, I like this one thing and I have faith in this one thing. And my interpretation is that this is good and doesn't mean that. And this other thing I think is bad and irresponsible. And this is my reading of it. I think it really comes down to what we want to ascribe to something. I think that with this film in particular and what we're talking about, my big struggle with it all the time is, and it's not just this film, we've done it before, I'm so tired of having to argue about the pros and cons of a movie with somebody who hasn't seen it. Yeah.
Right.
Another film that's similar is we just, it came back in the news because of the retheming of a ride, but Song of the South was back in the news again. Mm-hmm. And the fact of the matter is, Song of the South is a terrible film.
Dog shit.
Also,
awful.
Yeah, and also an ignorant film, a very ignorant film. However, I do think it's one of those things where no person who has actually seen it sees a film that is worse than what they were imagining. I think all of us had, and I'm assuming we've all seen it now, right? I know Tom has, and I know you guys were doing a Disney watch. It is a weirdly innocuous film. Not that it's completely inoffensive, but it's kind of like if your uncle had to put on a play and you're just like, oh, I don't love some of these takes, but it is not the movie that any of us, I think, pictured it to be because it was so inaccessible. And its inaccessibility, I think, makes it worse. And I think that with this film, it's inarguable that the depictions of people of color are offensive and ill-informed. I think there's different reads on why those characters are played that way. If you guys haven't seen on HBO Max, there's a great panel discussion Tom and I watched that gets into the character of Prissy and why it was played this way.
Oof.
Yeah, well, but that's what's so interesting. I mean, first off, Butterfly McQueen is a fascinating person.
Mm-hmm.
I highly recommend anybody look her up. She was a scholar and just an incredible human being and deserves a biopic. You know, and she had problems with the way that some of the scenes were played. But all the same, to get back to your question, Justin, I guess that's to me, and I'm so sorry to bogart some microphone there, but that to me is a big thing that weighs on me about interpretation.
I'm of the mind that the movie is the thing, and idiots are gonna just twist it to fit their worldview. I mean, how many of these dipshits in the alt-right and these MAGA trolls are like gonna watch Star Wars and be like, yeah, Star Wars is great. We're the rebels, and be like, no, assholes, you're the stormtroopers. You're the fascist. I was born in Brooklyn. I come from I got cousins, my older brother, we're all into rap. So I grew up with rap and rap culture. And even today, how many of these people, these fucking idiots, hold up Scarface's I want to be like Scarface? Motherfucker, he dies at the end because he becomes too coked out of his mind and burns his entire life down. I mean, to do something like Wolf of Wall Street, you got Goodfellas that a lot of idiots, especially Mike can attest to this. Every idiot we grew up with that then became a cop loves Goodfellas.
What?
It's not wrong.
But it's a mood, and they're like, oh yeah, I love Goodfellas. My life is just like Goodfellas. My family, oh yeah, we're really good. And you go, okay, but the end of the movie very explicitly has Henry Hill thrown into a fucking hovel in the Midwest alone. Everyone he knows either dead or in jail because of him. How do you look up to Henry fucking Hill at the end of this movie? So, I mean, I think there's a vast difference in some jerk off shooting John Lennon because J.D. Salinger wrote a book and what Leni Riefenstahl did. Leni Riefenstahl made propaganda movies. That's like straight up, okay, you're just a bad person who made the world explicitly worse. Like D.W. Griffith with Birth of a Nation. I would put Gone with the Wind more in that almost J.D. Salinger area. Maybe not as far to the end of that scale because there is a lot of bad decisions and ignorance, which I ultimately don't think is actually supposed to be mean-spirited or hateful or propagandistic for a Confederate pro-slavery way of life. So I'm of the opinion that, and people just need to be able to make the movies they want to make, and we judge them, and idiots are just gonna take it the way they want to, because if they had any semblance of self-awareness, they would realize 99% of the art they ingest and apparently love is not actually for them.
Yeah, I think like in the context of like Gone with the Wind, the important thing about it is like accessibility, right? Because like the only way anyone can watch this movie is on HBO Max, and the only way you can watch it is if you watch that like 10-minute clip of someone like contextualizing and like saying, this movie you're about to watch, it's a bad movie. It's an important movie in these regards, but it is a very bad movie, and you need to understand the history behind it.
Or just like bad in terms of its context.
Yeah, it's like culturally insensitive in that regard. And I think like with comparing it to Song of the South, where you can't watch it anywhere unless you want to watch the shitty version on YouTube, like Disney should just like own up to it, but like own up to it and be like, yes, we're sorry, this is what happened. Make a documentary about it, you know, like just like apologize. But what they're doing with like burying it and like just erasing it from their parks, they're just kind of like culpable, right? They're just kind of like trying to erase it from their past without owning up to it.
Which is, you know, more problematic to me than the actual offensive parts of the movie, because, you know, I think movies are made in context. They're made in a specific time, and those times help inform the movie. And
Yeah.
by trying to say that didn't exist is almost like saying, oh, the Civil War wasn't fought about slavery, it was about states' rights. It's not helping us see where we were, how far we've come, and how far we still need to go. So I like that they put the context in front of Gone with the Wind. As much as I think it's ridiculous and silly for anybody to watch Blazing Saddles and not get that where it's coming from, I'm still okay with it. HBO Max putting a context clip in front of it, because I'd rather it be there than somebody bury it. I think it's pretty cowardly. It's pretty offensive in my mind to just say, oh no, we never made these mistakes. Well, motherfucker, explain Splash Mountain to me.
Exactly.
I mean, it's not wrong to say, I mean, we're Americans. We're in America. There's nothing wrong with acknowledging the deep flaws that make up our country. The flaws we're still dealing with now. The country's on fire, not just because of a pandemic, but because of deep-seated fucking racism built into the police of this country. America is about the dream being better than what we were yesterday. So by erasing that, I think that's more fucked up than actually having it and wrangling with the thing. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
To jump on that, if I may, I was thinking about the fact, and there's a lot of things, we're having discussions now. You feel like there's pieces of pop culture that somebody will bring up and say, well, we need to change this because it has racist origins. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't. I'm saying this more to the angle of, when you hear that the ice cream truck is changing its song because Turkey in the Straw has minstrel origins. There's so much that us people in suburbia, us, white privileged kids, we don't know, because we just excised all of that from history. We don't talk about it, we don't approach it, and therefore we don't even know where some of these things come from. And I think that it's a challenge, because again, it is about contextualizing. And I also want to say the intro they have to HBO Max, I think is great, because the woman who does the intro is also on that panel that they added on there. Which is, it's not necessarily just outright going, oh, this movie's bad, or this movie's offensive, or anything like that. It is simply helping us to reconcile with that it is possible for something to be beautiful and flawed, or beautiful and offensive. And I think that one of the things we struggle with as audiences now is there is always this reaction when something bad comes out, when somebody gets canceled. These people who like to go, well, I was never a fan of them. Well, I always thought it sucked. Oh, I never liked this. I actually never liked that. And I think that makes it worse. And I think that reaction to basically go, if this is offensive, or if this is hateful or evil, it cannot also be beautiful, puts us at a disadvantage, because it makes us not prepared for essentially the hateful ideology to be smuggled in the form of, the apple on the tree of knowledge, if you will. We almost have this idea that every insidious thing and every bad person will look like a lumbering villain, drumming their fingers together and going, yeah,
Right.
And how many times do we have that discussion about whether it's the current president or so many people where they go, he can't be racist. I saw him smile at a non-white person once,
Right.
Well, if he was racist, he'd be wearing a Klan hood. And it's like, no, man, we have not prepared ourselves. We do not allow ourselves to recognize the fact that something can be two things. That Gone with the Wind can be beautifully made and seductively charming and technically brilliant, and the story can be compelling, and also its depictions are undeniably racist, and that some of its stances, and particularly the novel that it's based on, stances are entirely wrong-headed and vile. I mean, I mentioned this to you guys off mic, but I tried reading the book. I got about halfway through before I was like, Jesus. Because if you think the movie has maybe some pro-Confederate leanings, it is genuinely like watching Paul Verhoeven's Starship Troopers and then trying to read the book. The book explicitly has the Klan in it, in a positive light. The book is overtly and terribly racist. The work they did admittedly, it's still a stock character, but the work they did from the book version of Mammy to the Oscar-winning Hattie McDaniel's performance, there's a chasm there in terms of how it was written. And I also think that, to all of their credit, the people of color in this film are doing their damnedest. Butterfly McQueen, I mentioned before, is amazing as a performer in general. And she did not want to do a lot of those things, and she talked to Selznick about it, and she talked him out of some and was stuck doing some others. I know that several people I read suggested that she was playing the character both as a parallel to Scarlett's own selfishness and also playing it in this idea that during times of slavery, some slaves would pretend to be ignorant as a survival tool, and that was how McQueen was doing it. But at the same time, I mean, Hattie McDaniel is undeniably bringing so much to that role that is not on the page. But I think we need to be able to reconcile those things, and I think that becomes hard when we have to put everything in a binary. And I think that what that HBO Max intro does so well is make that point that something can be two things, that we can process the negatives and the offensiveness and also recognize other elements of the film.
For sure. I was telling Justin whenever it was really the Mammy focus scenes and the Butterfly McQueen scenes, I was like, you know what? This sucks that they had to play these roles and these roles were written this way. But they could have gotten white people and done blackface. They could have went there. But the fact that they chose black actors and paid them, maybe not enough, but paid them, and one ended up getting an Oscar, that's monumental in itself. Still bad that they had to play those roles, but that's still a landmark in history.
It's again funny that, context of time and everything. It's it sucks that they had to play roles like that. I mean, if you tell me that story, those roles are going to have to be filled by somebody. But, at least it was done in 1939 and not, 2010 with Viola Davis.
Ugh.
Well, yeah, the help was similar. But can I make one point, though? It's funny you mentioned specifically blackface, Lupita.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about, I just watched today another film that came out in 1939 and was nominated for a couple of Oscars. And we'll talk about the Oscars in a second. I have a couple more things I want to touch on real quick. But one of the other Oscar nominees is a movie called Babes in Arms, which is a musical starring Mickey Rooney and Judy Garland. And it seems like it's going to be this innocuous movie about they got to put on a show. It's just the two of them and they got to put on a show to show that the kids can do it just like the grown-ups. And then in this movie, the middle of this film is their show, and it starts with Judy Garland singing about how her daddy was a minstrel show performer, and she wants to be one too. And then it launches into a full minstrel performance. And when I say that, I mean, when we talk about blackface in old films, sometimes it's a case of Fred Astaire in Swing Time, who does a tribute to his tap teacher in blackface, which is hard to watch. And you can sit down and you can read things that go, well, in that time, they thought of it as a tribute. And in that time, it was a different context. And he was just doing it to look more like Bojangles. And you can read that and go, okay, this is still tough to watch. I mean, I guess that's your excuse. But this was the caricatures, the voices, the songs. It was one of the most painful things. It was truly excruciating. It was disgusting. And I like Judy Garland. I like McGurn. It is truly, I mean, a full minstrel show, And the thing that struck me watching it was that I am not going to excuse that with it was the times. We can look at, we don't always have a perspective on times. It was 1939. That is 2 years after Zora Neale Hurston publishes Their Eyes Were Watching God. That is, no, I mean it, that is 3
you're right,
years.
yeah.
3 years after Jesse Owens represents America in Berlin at the Olympics to refute Hitler's master race. That same year, Marian Anderson sang on the Lincoln Memorial, and Crystal Bird Fawcett sits as the first black representative in the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. There was no fucking argument. I mean, there is never an argument. There is no, it is unfathomable to think that anyone in this country was able to look another human being in the eyes and see them as less than, but it is unfathomable to deny someone their personhood like that in that year. And what is interesting to me about that is the fact that when we are looking at Gone with the Wind has some very, very problematic depictions. But it was interesting, Lupita, when you mentioned they could have done blackface. There was a part of me that instinctually wants to go, well, they wouldn't have done it by them, but they fucking did, in Babes in Arms. And it is so difficult. I think that, and the other thing is the struggle with that movie is that it's trying to comment on racism in some points. It tries to do a scene that on paper, if I said you were watching a scene where the slave had to go outside in the rain and wander through the mud to fetch a chicken so that the white people inside dry in their fancy clothes could have dinner, you'd say, wow, that's an interesting comment on race. But the caricature that they make the black actor play is such a minstrel stock character that it becomes impossible to fully give them credit for that. It's such a difficult thing to wrap one's head around, but I just wanted to comment on that Babes in Arms thing in particular and how much that really fucking threw me. Now, Lupita, I would love to talk to you about this in particular, because you mentioned your vantage point watching the staircase scene as a woman, and I was thinking about, granted, again, I'm not the most alpha male, so I have a different, viewpoint a bit, but Scarlett. I want to talk about Scarlett because I think that Scarlett is such a fascinating character. HBO Max, like I said, had that panel there, and all three women on that panel simultaneously acknowledged that Scarlett was a compelling character for them and, feeling some love or some sympathy for Scarlett while acknowledging how vilely selfish she is and nasty she is and terrible she is. And what struck me watching it, and I would love to get your take on that too and how you feel about her, what struck me watching it, a couple of images came to mind. One is, of course, Tracy Flick in Election. But another one that came to mind is Daniel Plainview in There Will Be Blood. And it also made me think about the reaction that we had to deal with in the mid-2000s toward Walter White's wife and Rick's wife on The Walking Dead, and this thing that we tend to do in media that if a male character, a male protagonist, is selfish and will do anything to survive and is ruthless and will kill people, they're an anti-hero. And they are to be related to and celebrated and commended. And then the attitude seemed to be, especially, again, in that mid-2000s era, that if a woman does a single thing for herself that steps out of line, she is to be condemned, she is the villain. And to look at a movie from 1939 that makes a protagonist that is so, on paper, unlikable, that is a woman doing whatever she's got to do to survive and throwing everyone she can under the bus and just getting by, to have that kind of, and to have broad appeal with female viewers. I mean, I look at Scarlett as what we would, what we now call an anti-hero, and I connect to that, and I do find myself very compelled by her behavior. And I was wondering if, what was your response, again, from that vantage point of being a modern day female viewer of this film and that character, and maybe in light of how we respond to female characters today?
Yeah, I really admired how Vivien Leigh really portrayed Scarlett O'Hara, because she plays 16 and then 29 at the end, so she has a lot of ages to portray with Scarlett. And she can get whiny, she can get kind of impatient, but whenever you look at her, she's very determined. She kind of fumbles and loses her footing whenever she constantly gets rebuffed by Ashley, and so she doesn't know quite what to do. And then the war happens, and she figures out, oh no, this is what I need to do. I need to save Tara. I need to do what I can to keep this history alive. And it's admirable what she's trying to do, right? Because she has this passion for it and she has this determination. What's so frustrating about her is that her discompassion for everyone else. And I think it's just so frustrating. So that's what I was feeling every time I was watching her on screen, is just this back and forth with I admire what you're doing, but I don't admire what you stand for. And just the eyebrows on Vivien Leigh, really, the stares she gives people. I'm just you are frightening. And I think I really saw a lot of particularly like the white women in Texas in her, because she is very much like becomes the matriarch of her quote unquote family or her society, right? And that's what I see a lot of white women in like Dallas socialite culture, and like a lot of women who become like that alpha woman in their circle, right? So it was just such an interesting character to watch.
Does she remind you of my grandmother?
She does remind me of Justin's grandmother a whole lot. Like, she's very subdued at some points, but then she just like goes for it.
I want to pivot from there into something closer toward the end to round us out, which is we always try and talk about the Oscars when it comes to these films. And of course, this was massive at the Oscars. Something I find so interesting, to touch on that when you're talking about Vivien Leigh, is that the search for Scarlett O'Hara and who would play Scarlett O'Hara was massive. We cannot comprehend what that was like, in a way, you know? Insofar as, of course, now Justin and I have both written for comic book news sites, so we've all had to do those blips of so-and-so might play this superhero, right? we do those. But what is crazy is that more people were talking about the search for Scarlett O'Hara when there was far fewer media outlets.
Right.
Everyone was up for this role. Katharine Hepburn was up for this role. One of my favorites, Lucille Ball, was up for this role.
Oh, thank God Lucy
Fucking
passed.
think of that.
Thank God she passed.
I'd watch it.
What if at the end of her taking chocolates off the conveyor belt, she said, "I'll never go hungry again"?
That's the crossover we need.
Now, what's interesting is if you look at the DVD, the DVD I have has a number of the screen tests they did. And the one that I found so interesting is we had just finished doing Modern Times, and I started watching this, and Charlie Chaplin's lover, Paulette Goddard, was very close to getting Scarlett O'Hara.
Whoa.
Okay.
The reason she didn't get it was in part because David O. Selznick worried that if word got out about her non-marital living situation with Charlie Chaplin, it would cause a scandal and ruin the film.
Jesus.
Interestingly, he then cast Vivien Leigh, who was living with Laurence Olivier. But to me, Vivien Leigh seems like such an obvious casting choice because, and I'm going to say this with absolute respect, I mean this with absolute respect because I do love this character, Vivien Leigh had the finest resting bitch face of any performer in the history of cinema. And you need that for Scarlett O'Hara.
Yes.
The other person who seemed close to the role was Bette Davis. And in a weird thing, and I recommend you guys look it up if you're ever curious because I find it fascinating, Bette Davis did not get Scarlett O'Hara, and her studio, to appease her, threw her in this movie called Jezebel with Henry Fonda, which is another Southern set drama. Except this one takes place in the middle of a plague of yellow fever and everyone gets quarantined. So it's really fun to watch now.
Hell yeah.
And that movie ended up coming out before Gone with the Wind. Bette Davis won Best Actress for Jezebel the year before Gone with the Wind. So Jezebel is kind of, think of it as Jezebel is the ants to Gone with the Wind's A Bug's Life. Now, how much do you guys know offhand, because I'm fascinated by this, about the year 1939 for the Oscars?
Ooh, what that was well, I don't know about the Oscars because I always forget about like the year movies come out and then whenever they're honored. Was it Wizard of Oz nominated at that time?
Yes. It is a fucking murderer's row. I watch them all now and it's fascinating. It is the best year the Oscars ever had. So Gone with the Wind is nominated alongside Dark Victory, which is a Bette Davis drama with Ronald Reagan and Humphrey Bogart. Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which is a quintessential teacher drama. Love Affair, Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Ninotchka, Of Mice and Men, Stagecoach, The Wizard of Oz, and the Laurence Olivier Wuthering Heights.
Jesus Christ.
Couple interesting things about that. Because that is such a good year, 1939 is also the most represented year in the National Film Registry. There are 19 films from 1939 in the National Film Registry, most of which were just mentioned, but also Only Angels Have Wings, Young Mr. Lincoln, Tevye, Cologne from the Diary of Ray and Esther, a lot of stuff. So what's fascinating about that, again, it's a murderer's row, and Gone with the Wind almost entirely dominates. It won Best Picture, won Best Director. It was nominated for Best Actor for Clark Gable. He lost to Robert Donat from Goodbye, Mr. Chips, which is one of the only losses this thing racks up. Vivien Leigh wins Best Actress. Hattie McDaniel wins Best Supporting Actress. Olivia de Havilland's also nominated for Best Supporting Actress that year. It wins Best Screenplay. Interestingly, it loses Best Original Score to The Wizard of Oz. It loses Best Sound Recording to a movie called When Tomorrow Comes, wins Best Art Direction, wins Best Cinematography Color, wins Best Editing, and loses Best Special Effects to a movie called The Rains Came, which is about a town that gets flooded. Now, for my money, The Burning of Atlanta should have gotten that award, especially because, I don't know if you guys know, Selznick literally set fire to the lot.
That's what I thought when I saw that. I was like, that looks real. That looks real.
In order for them to build Tara and the sets for Gone with the Wind, they had all these sets in the backlot they needed to get rid of. And so David O. Selznick decided, let's just set them all on fire, burn them down, film stunt doubles in the Rhett and Scarlett parts in the carriage because we haven't cast them yet. And then we'll just use that for the movie. And if you watch the one scene where, if you remember, the big structure is collapsing as the cart runs by in front of it, that is the gate that King Kong walks out of in King Kong.
Oh, wow.
They just torched the fucking ground. Now, I bring up the Oscars for two reasons. Well, we always wrap up with the Oscars, but I bring it up for two reasons that I want to address. One that I think is really interesting, just a little fun fact, and Tom and I were talking about this. Thomas Mitchell won Best Supporting Actor for John Ford's Stagecoach. Thomas Mitchell also played Scarlett O'Hara's father in Gone with the Wind, and was also in Mr. Smith Goes to Washington.
Oh, wow.
So he had a banner year. The other thing I want to touch on, besides, I mean, look, there's a lot of great performances. I mean, the amazing thing about Best Actor is the fact that Jimmy Stewart is in for Mr. Smith Goes to Washington, Mickey Rooney is in for Babes in Arms, Clark Gable's in for Gone with the Wind. It's like every big name you can think of. But the one I want to touch on, if I may, is Best Director, because here's the thing that kind of sticks in my craw here. Do you give Victor Fleming Best Director for a movie that he only directed half of, if even?
No.
Can you just say Best Direction, just sort of generally? But I guess maybe the Oscars won't even allow that. But I hear that as a question, though.
Especially, I think when you look at that year and you're like, you could have given it to Frank Capra or John Ford. They made the whole movies. Or fuck it, if you want to give it to Victor Fleming so bad, he made another whole movie that you nominated.
Yeah, I hear it's a pretty good one. May have aged pretty well.
I think we may talk about it at some point. Who knows? But yeah, I just find that so interesting. And yeah, it did dominate the Oscars. I know that it's also Gable not winning Best Actor may seem like a surprise. He did win Best Actor a couple years earlier for It Happened One Night, which might be the only reason that movie did not get all 5 major awards. But
gotta love
who
those
knows?
Oscars politics.
I will say Robert Dunant is very good in Goodbye, Mr. Chips. It is but like all of those movies have had some influence. You know, obviously Stagecoach and Wizard of Oz and Wuthering Heights and Ninochka and Mischief, we all know those. Even Love Affair, a movie that you would think no one's heard of and doesn't really have any consequence, gets remade about 20 years later as An Affair to Remember.
Oh my God.
So this is a wild, fascinating year, 1939.
I would just like to say, I think Olivia de Havilland gives the heads and shoulders best performance in the movie. That's just me.
Okay, with that, one trivia fact that I kind of love. So the secondary couple in this film is Olivia de Havilland and Leslie Howard, right?
Right.
Leslie Howard would die maybe 3 years after this film's release, 2 years, I think, fighting in the war as a spy for the British government. So he does not live 5 years after this film's release. Yeah, wild. Meanwhile, Olivia de Havilland died, as of this recording, I think 3 weeks ago.
Yeah.
Insane.
That's buck wild.
An icon.
We stand a queen.
Ugh.
I just want to quickly, because we mentioned POV before, and I wanted to just kind of touch on that. I think the biggest flaw with this movie, like as a movie, but also as its reputation as time goes on, is it's so focused on Scarlett that there is no broader sense of like, we jump to this character. If Scarlett's not in the room, we kind of aren't there. And
I suppose I guess that's, I mean, I don't have a problem with that perspective.
That's not what I mean. It's that by doing that, it has to limit the amount we get with the black characters. And because it's 1939, they can't actually be accurate with how bad slavery was in a movie. They have to like whitewash it and make it not as bad and just kind of hope slavery's bad. And I don't know, I think by doing that, I think that's sort of the biggest thing that kind of holds this movie back for people.
I think that's, but that also raises a question of, is that, and I don't mean to answer one way or the other. I mean, that brings us to a question of, is that art's fault? Or is that any works of art's fault? So I think it's something that sticks in my craw a little bit that we have to reconcile with everything. And this may seem like a weird pull, but when they did that anniversary special for Saturday Night Live, and they were doing a portion that was a Q&A with Jerry Seinfeld. Does anyone remember what I'm talking about? Or am I pulling completely out of nowhere? Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And they had Ellen Cleghorn, one of the most underrated Saturday Night Live performers, and who never really got a career after Saturday Night Live, gets up and delivers a very over-the-top delivery of a question, which is, well, how come there were no black people on the Seinfeld show? And Jerry goes, yes, I'm sorry, we didn't solve all of society's ills, and brushes it aside. And I think about that moment a lot because it is a weird moment in how we deal with pop culture for two reasons. One, I understand the Jerry Seinfeld part of it. I do understand that feeling and that frustration when you're talking about a work of art that's trying to do one thing and somebody says, well, why didn't it solve this other problem? You know, if you're talking about, if you're showing a particular moment in history and somebody goes, well, why didn't you talk about this other part in history? And you want to just go, because that's not what we're dealing with, guys. Like, I'm trying to talk about this one particular thing. You know, I feel some kind of sympathy to that. You know, especially when people are making a period piece and they're talking about one particular issue, and you know, you have a conversation of, you know, you see it all the time. I remember, you know, Spike Lee getting it with pretty much any film he makes now, but it's, you know, when he made Black Klansman, he was like, I'm tackling a very particular topic here, and people went, why didn't you talk about this other thing? And he's like, because that's not what this is about. That's another movie. So I get that, but at the same time, bringing up that in a show set in New York, there's really no black representation in Seinfeld, that's a fair criticism. That while that shouldn't mean, hey, let's never watch Seinfeld, let's take it off the television, that's a criticism that, you know, an artist can be expected to address. And to play it off in that very over-the-top way also sticks with me. So it's one of those moments that I come back to a lot when we talk about this. And I think with Gone with the Wind, you know, simultaneously I can sit back and say, well, it wasn't a movie about slavery specifically, so it was going to do that subtly in the fact that we didn't touch on this, but in the fact that it has a scene where Scarlett no longer able to exploit slave labor, exploits prison labor, and directly addresses the fact that the 13th Amendment allowed for the exploitation of prison labor. It has those moments, but you're right, it doesn't address it more directly. And I kind of both feel like, as a work of art, it was doing one particular thing, and maybe we should let it do its own thing. But also, it does have an obligation to depict the horrors of America's original sin.
Listen, I'm very much of the opinion every movie doesn't have to be about everything. A movie can be focused, but this movie is about that. It has the black characters it has, but then it also has the conspicuous lack of other black characters in other scenes by like, well, we really can't show field hands, so it's kind of just left to your imagination that someone got whipped and beat to shit making this magical land. But Mammy and Pork are happy in the house. It's just it feels like they had to tackle it in a way, because even if you're only focusing on Scarlett, there's no way her life is not going to intersect with the slavery of the time. But being a movie made in 1939, they just really, really couldn't, like, just because of how movies were allowed to be made, not actually tackle it. So it could only rely on these sort of cheap cliches, stereotype, mammy, like, house slave stuff that they could only do at the time, but is now giving it this worse reception now than it may have. It's that thing of, it's not trying to be offensive, but because of the limitations of the time, it now plays offensive.
But there's also this really gross moment in the second or third act where there's freed slaves and they're all shown as dumb, and they're being preyed on by these carpetbagging northerners that are coming in to just pretend to care about them, but they're only there to steal their vote. And I mean, they knew what they were doing. That was not a scene about history. It felt like, to me, that was a scene about nobody cares about the black people. They just want the black vote. And it felt very gross.
And you know, it's interesting you say that, Justin, because to me, I looked at that, and while I certainly think that's a valid interpretation, I also thought about the fact that what it was to me when I looked at that moment, it also reminded me of the fact that it was a little acknowledgement of the fact that one thing we don't want to, here in the North, one thing we don't want to deal with about that period of time is we kind of want to pretend like it was Abraham Lincoln went up and said, slavery is inhuman, everyone is absolutely equal, and here in the North we fix all that. There's absolutely no racism, and only in the South is the bad place. And of course, you mentioned the carpetbaggers, and that really was a thing. And they're really, you know, people, whether from the South or the North, really viciously preyed upon people, freed slaves, and the exploitation. And this is something that I think we struggle with a lot, and we have to acknowledge, is that the exploitation and abuse of freed slaves and pretty much any minority group in this country did not end when we resolved the biggest issue. You know,
right?
It is, and then that goes across the board. I mean, you know, not to get too off track, but like we cannot pretend like, you know, the minute Cesar Chavez finished his protests, we went, well, that's it, no more problems there. You know, like the abuse and exploitation of minorities in this country does not end by just ending the largest atrocities, and
right.
that unfortunately, even when we can't just say, well, you're free now, figure it out. You know, there's
yeah, that scene felt very much like the prison labor thing. Maybe too subtly, I don't know, but that just felt to me like another example of just like, oh, the South and just, well, the country in general is just gonna shift how it uses black people. And
Right.
I also think with that there's something compelling, not positive per se, but I do think that there is a lot. It's interesting you mentioned that moment, Justin. I can't speak to this, of course. I would love for someone to speak to that moment, because it's not just the fact that they have, and you're correct, they play the freed former slaves who are being exploited very dumbly, but that is also in response to Mammy walking through the crowd and calling them all trash and dismissing them all and wanting to continue serving Scarlet as she has always done. And that I don't think, to me, when I watch that, and maybe it was intended that way at the time, I don't look at that as something symbolic where Mammy is 100% right. I think instead it adds an extra dimension to her character. And the truth is, the script does not give her a lot to do, but there are so many things to the way she delivers lines and the way she embodies certain moments that Hattie McDaniel does that make the character so compelling. That scene sticks out to me. And also later when she's taking Red up the stairs, taking Olivia de Havilland up the stairs. Yes, when Scarlett got shoved down the stairs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And she's, and Mammy is freaking out because she's like, the kid died, fell off the horse. And she wants to say, I told him don't do that. But she can't say that.
Right.
She knew that kid was going to die. But so when she's taking them upstairs, like, it's clear that this character is suffering. And the fact that she has, despite being quote unquote freed, she is given zero agency.
Mm-hmm.
And she just has to deal with the tumultuous life that she is now given because of these two people who talk to her and respond to her as though they were talking to someone they saw as equal, but also give her no agency and pay her no mind. And I think that that's a compelling moment.
I do think there is one good thing in the script. I mean, as you're saying, she's bringing a lot to it, but I do think there is a good element of the script of that. How the movie's playing Scarlet as the South, Rhett as the progressive part of the South, or even he's the North, and that Mammy loves Scarlet. She's more of a mom to her than her actual mother was, and there's this love for her, and this love for Tara, but when Rhett buys her that dress, she wears it underneath her work clothes for the rest of her life. So that there's this element to her of saying, like, yeah, I do know what's going on's kind of fucked up, but this is my lot in life, and I'm kind of making the best of it. And I kind of wish things were a little more like Rhett's way of things, but also he killed this little girl.
Do we have any more? Do you guys have any more thoughts before we wrap up? Or?
I was just gonna say that, like, I know that Scarlett and Mammy are supposed to have, like, this loving, like, faux daughter and mother relationship, but just, like, the way that Mammy always comes back at Scarlett and the way that Scarlett always comes back at her, I'm surprised that Mammy is content with her life, just because it's just, like, Scarlett just doesn't give you the time of day. She doesn't care about your opinion, even though you might think she does deep down. And, like, I think that's another thing. Like, even though the movie doesn't show blatant abuse of slaves, like, that's also, like, just, like, mental, like psychological abuse from Scarlett's part, just because, like, she is literally putting the clothes on your back. She's waiting on you hand and foot, and, like, she's smarter than you, little child, but you're not listening to her.
Well, I guess that goes back to the thing of they can't really, like, contrast it to, well, if she doesn't suck it up and deal with Scarlett's bullshit, she might have to go work in the fields.
Yeah, but, like, there's still no, like, punishment for her, because, like, she combats Scarlett, she, like, badmouths her, she is a very good character, but she, like, there's no, like, repercussions for her words at all.
That's probably just the way they're going about that. For as much as these Southerners talk, they really can't do anything without Mammy, so they kind of just tolerate it because, well, she does take care of everything we can't do because, again, in a way of the movie trying to get into it, they do make a lot of Scarlett, like, kind of the sacrifice Scarlett has to make working in the fields to make Tara great again. Yeah, it's just it's, I don't know, it's just like the way a lot of the stuff in the movie is like, there's stuff there that kind of helps its cause, but then there's just so much cloudiness in of the stuff it can't do, so yeah, no, I don't disagree with the stuff that, yeah, the Mammy stuff isn't great. It's not, like, it just isn't, but there are, like, the movie's its own worst enemy, but also, like, it's also got some smart ways to kind of try to subvert some of this stuff, I mean, it was the weird thing watching this movie of just like, okay, this is kind of making sense. Oh, okay. It's an interesting choice.
Right. Yeah, so one last thing that I wanted to remark on is how much of my favorite movies I saw in this movie. It's the next, like, 30 years of Westerns that I love so much. I mean, 1939 movies, typically when you'll watch movies from the 30s, they feel older. Like Stagecoach or The Grapes of Wrath. Love John Ford, but his movies at this point felt older. Grapes of Wrath immediately feels like Lawrence of Arabia, like something that came out 20, 30 years later. And it was sort of astounding to me just in the way it feels. It's something intangible about that. Maybe it's the scale. Maybe it's been just preserved better. I don't know. But in the way that it felt out of its time, even though it was bound to its time and its issues, the way it felt out of its time and its presentation was very impactful. But, like, Titanic, I got from this so much.
Oh, yeah.
Have you seen Phoenix? It's
No.
a German film from, like, the last 10 years or so, and it's this relationship between two people that's this metaphor for post-war Germany. I mean, that feels like Gone with the Wind. Its reaches are so broad and in so many of my favorite things that it is sort of undeniably something worth.
Shit, Mike said it to me. He texted it to me the other day. Rhett and Scarlett, you could even see in movies like fucking Smokey and the Bandit.
Yeah.
You know, it's funny you talk about that. The wide reach this movie has. We recorded Star Wars the other day, and everybody talks about Star Wars being the movie that broke Hollywood and everyone's trying to get bigger, bigger, bigger. Gone with the Wind is kind of that too.
Yeah.
But like, because once TV comes into play, every studio's trying to make their Gone with the Wind, their big, colorful thing that you can't do on TV because, as everyone likes to say, adjusted for inflation, ticket sales-wise, this is still the most successful movie of all time.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And it is in like every way possible. This movie is just influential in ways that we're still even like just talking about, like, oh yeah, this thing too is influential. Like fucking Lando. Like Lando
Right.
Calrissian is like
Spitting image.
which I guess is ultimately the argument for it being in the National Film Registry.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree there. It's in the DNA of so many films. And I also think that there's something to, as we were addressing, the things that it does touch on and the things that if you're coming to it with the intent to take something away from it, you will. It's possible to watch this thing completely shut down, and it's possible, like with any of these films, and this is something that we're dealing with the show, and why Tom and I agreed we're going to come at this with the vantage point of going in with the idea that these films have value. Not trying to do one of these Citizen Kane's overrated, those things, and instead come at value. Because I think that even if you start from that vantage point, you like a movie more than you would have if you went in with this crossed arm thing of, all right, you're supposed to be so good, show me what you got. With this movie, like, it's impossible not to look at it and see that it is a film talking about the horrors of war. The leg amputation scene and all that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's impossible not to see the influence on other films like Mrs. Miniver, and like Tom saying, it's in the DNA of so many movies. And also, in truth, we barely got a chance to touch on it because there's just so much, but that ending and its ambiguity, I'm sure there are plenty of people who watch that and go, oh, she's going to survive. She's going to rebuild Tara. She's going to be a survivor. And I look at that scene as almost identical to another Vivien Leigh role, which is Streetcar Named Desire, which is, oh, she's so delusional.
Right.
Like, this is very Sunset Boulevard. Like, this man just left you because you can't let go of the past. And all you're thinking of is, I gotta go back to Tara.
Reclaim her
Like,
roots.
that's so tragic. That's so, I'm ready for my close-up, Mr. DeMille. The truth of it is, it has its problems. There's no denying it has its problems. And I think that the reason, like Tom says, that this is in the registry is because it's just, there's so much there, good and bad. There's so much to take from it. And I think that I certainly don't begrudge anybody who watches it and says that's not for me, or somebody who, again, Tom and I have our star ratings on this film may be very different, but we both watch it and take something away from it because it's impossible not to.
It's also just impossible not to talk about it afterwards, right? You can't just like turn it on a Sunday, spend 3 hours watching it, and then be like, all right, like next movie, like get on with your day. It's like you want to show it to your kids and be like, so what did you think? What did everyone think? What are your thoughts?
Right.
Well, Justin, Lupita, thank you guys so much for not only joining us, for picking this film and making sure we did this early on in the show. Because it was one of those ones that we did not think anyone was going to pick, and we thought we were really going to have to fight for. And I'm so glad you guys came on and put the thought into this too. This was certainly not something where I think either of us felt unchallenged in where we stood on this film beforehand, which is, I don't know about you, Tom, but that's like my favorite kind of episode, when we come away thinking maybe what we thought before was not necessarily the right interpretation.
Yes, thank you very much for giving us as maybe not as hefty as Gone with the Wind, but quite the hefty podcast episode, because there's a lot to talk about, and I thought this conversation was pretty great for a movie that I think I'm safe in saying I'm on the lower end of the totem pole of liking it.
But you watched it, and you can say that.
Exactly.
I watched it. It was a guillotine hanging over my head my entire life as a film fan, of just like, well, I'm gonna have to get to it. I gotta get to it. I can't talk about it until I see it. Yes, Spike Lee, I watched the beginning of BlacKkKlansman, but I can't fucking say if I agree with you or not. But now I finally have seen it, and Spike, this is an official call out. I'm coming for you.
But no, and I agree. And the truth is, no matter your rating of it, no one can say from this discussion, it's very clear you not only watched it, you watched it with an open mind. And that's all that we're trying to do with this show in general, is to just encourage people to watch these things. If they've been inducted into the registry, they are part of the American cultural landscape. They are deemed historically significant, aesthetically significant. Let's grapple with that. And I'm so glad that you guys joined us to grapple with that. You were the perfect guest for this, and I'm so glad that you guys joined us.
Oh, thank you.
Oh my God, thank you. We're honored.
They like us. They really like us.
I have a hard time, I think, talking about this movie and like as sort of like the weird historical footprints in our culture. And I knew this was going to be one of our challenges. One of the things that gravitated me towards this, I had a project in college that forced me to look at a movie that is incredibly controversial, and yet the focus was more on the cinematography and more of the film production aspects. And it would ultimately be like, well, you're promoting the racism components of that. And it's like, no, we really need to stress that what we're talking about here, is important in some way. I don't think any of us are really representatives and can speak whether or not we accomplished what we did. I feel good about what we've done. The conversation that we had, I hope it resonates with people.
I think this was probably the biggest challenge we faced so far, not just because of how do we talk about it, but also, let's face it, thus far, we've pretty much liked all the movies we've talked about universally, right? And I think that in this case, obviously, like we acknowledged in the episode, Tom said he was on the lower end of the totem pole for this one. I was, in a different place on this one, but I think we were all able to talk about the movie for what it was. And that's, all we can do. And I think it's also important not to shy away from these things. I mean, Kyle, you were talking about a movie that you did in school. I'm assuming it was D.W. Griffith's Birth of a Nation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was.
And interestingly enough, if you watch the documentary they did about the registry, These Amazing Shadows, John Singleton is the director who pushed for Birth of a Nation to be in the registry. And he says, because he doesn't think these things should be shied away from. We should confront the flaws of this country and the original sin of this country and how it is intertwined with our media, instead of pretending that it is entirely divorced of that. And I hope we did that. And I hope people, took something away from it. And maybe some people decide to engage with the work.
As someone who's come into this new, who's had it hanging over him his whole life as a film fan, and with the just recent reappraisal, constant talking about it being a Confederate monument or whatever, I just think the movie's more complicated than people want to say. It's not the boogeyman under your bed waiting to get you. It's a part of history. It's something that needs to be wrangled with. You need to contend with it, deal with it. It might make you a better person being able to wrangle with something that's complicated and being able to say, well, I saw it, I respect it, I maybe even like it, and acknowledge its place as a relic of a bygone era with bygone sensibilities.
Outside of this show viewing life, you're a big B-movie guy, a big genre guy.
Yeah.
I know that you've fairly recently gotten into the giallo subgenre, the Italian horror guys. I mean, to watch those films, you certainly have to be able to reconcile with some plenty problematic elements in those.
I just watched the documentary about Lucio Fulci, and they get in. I mean, even the people that worked with them are like, yeah, Lucio, he liked women, but he also didn't like women. And, they get into how maybe a lot of the stuff in the movies is him working through shit that he was dealing with, some of the things he was contending with. It may not necessarily be the auteur theory, but a lot of filmmakers, decisions are being made for a reason. And things aren't clean all the time. Things aren't always nice or always perfect. And it's honestly more interesting to watch something messy because it's more human. It's more honest. It opens your mind up because then you have to wrangle with the shit inside of yourself instead of just constantly getting patted on the head saying, oh, you're a good liberal, you're good. You deserve to live in Williamsburg this weekend. It's fine. We talked about the anti-hero thing. You mentioned the anti-hero thing before. I don't understand how people can wrangle with watching art about anti-heroes and murderers and serial killers and, all this shit, and then have an actual shit fit when they watch a movie set during the Civil War that may not be as progressive as they are now. That everything that isn't like them has to be burned at the stake, which is kind of how we got to the place where we are now, of not actually wrangling all of the problems they were dealing with during the Civil War and letting it fester, and not dealing with it during Reconstruction, and letting it fester, and not dealing with the KKK reappraisal after Birth of a Nation, and then letting it fester. And there's no good that's going to come from just ignoring the past. It's silly, it's childish, and it doesn't do anybody any good.
I mean, I'm certainly of the opinion, look, I appreciate Lupita making the point that she grew up a person of color in Texas, and how that affects one's point of view. And I certainly, as we saw in that HBO Max introduction and as we saw in that panel, I am not going to sit here and say how a black filmgoer should feel about Gone with the Wind. I know what I feel when I watch, say, Babes in Arms, and I know what I feel there, but I'm certainly not going to tell anyone how they should feel. And I'm also not going to tell anyone who thinks they might be, adversely affected by watching it, that every human being should watch the film. I only think that, as I said at the start, that to talk about a movie, you should watch it. That's all I'm asking. That's all I'm asking of this show, and that's all we're doing is if you are going to talk about a work, watch it, engage with it, grapple with it. And don't shy away from that if that's the kind of thing you want to engage in. And that's, and look, it has its pros and cons. Tom, you were, again, to go back to the genre thing briefly, like, you are a person who watches these films and takes them in the proper context and understands that these are not an endorsement of certain points of view. But, you've certainly dealt with, and we don't need to name names of now defunct publications, but you've certainly had to deal with situations where some of the other people who are fans of these same films are maybe taking a very different takeaway from them. And you kind of have to go, I really like this. Wait, why do you like this?
Yeah.
And that's certainly difficult.
If you don't want to watch the thing, that's fine. But don't tell everybody that it shouldn't exist. Let it exist. Let people come to it if they want to come to it. It is different than a Confederate monument because, well, you have to go find Gone with the Wind. It's not looming over you when you leave your house.
So, guys, obviously with our criteria, your movie can't be, or movie's got to be at least 10 years old, has to be an American film. What film would you add to the registry?
I was thinking about it, and I had a couple things that I might have picked. And then in response to this selection is kind of in response to not just the film, but the whole conversation around it and the broader conversation. And in part because I mentioned watching Babes in Arms and that repugnant sequence in the middle. And I was thinking about how do we deal with the shameful parts of our history. And the fact that, as I acknowledged in the episode, whether it stays or not, that I grew up my whole life, I knew Turkey in the Straw, the song. I had no idea that its roots were in a minstrel show. And even then, in doing some digging, how murky that is in terms of which came first, the melody or the lyrics. How do we deal with that? And the fact that, we're going to talk next season about Duck Soup, and, Groucho Marx invokes the title of a song with an offensive word in the title. I remember when Tom and I watched it for a different podcast, that was a jarring moment apparently that song was sung by Paul Robeson, and it's just been lost in translation. And I think that the fact that we have put away so many problematic elements of our culture, means that now we don't have the tools to grapple with them. On the other hand, when these problematic things are presented without context, they can be misunderstood and exploited by people with bad intentions and with bigotry in their hearts. So I was thinking about, how do we deal with that? How do we grapple with that legacy, and how do we make ourselves aware of and sort of preserve those kind of shameful elements of our history in a way that does not endorse them? And I thought there was a film that does that really well. A fairly recent film that it depicts minstrel performances and depicts the degrading nature of them. And I'm sure Tom knows where I'm going now. Which is that I think that Spike Lee's Bamboozled, which was recently released by the Criterion Collection, is this amazing wrestle with racist depictions in media and how it relates to how we deal with racist media in present day. I mean, and how dehumanizing these portrayals were. It shows the process. It has a sequence that walks you through Savion Glover applying the makeup and shows the crowd reactions, and it is this network-esque satire of contemporary media that also seeks to preserve and depict the inhumanity of the minstrel show. And it is the only way, I think, to properly depict what that medium was like without falling into something like Babes in Arms that is unsettling and skin crawling. So I truly believe that Bamboozled, both as a great film, but also as a record of this particular thing, should be in the registry.
I figured that Mike was going to be making a pick along those lines, dealing with the deeper racial elements and the sort of controversy surrounding Gone with the Wind, and something that would deal with that in its own way. So I went and looked in areas more in line with the text, the structure, the historical epic aspect of the movie, the poisoned love triangle element of the story. A movie that almost ironically looks at an era and a time during its so-called heyday, and the characters thinking it's this heyday, but by the masterful touch of the filmmaker showing there never was a heyday. It was just the Wild West where you guys were able to crush people and enrich yourselves over blood money. How the central love triangle isn't actually a love triangle. It's something deeper, darker, and more upsetting, more American, very American-centric, the way this love triangle thing sort of happens. This movie has its connections to another movie, not one that'll ever be on the National Film Registry, because in very explicit ways, it's referencing Jean-Luc Godard's Contempt. So the movie I'm picking is Martin Scorsese's Casino. I just felt like there's no way Marty didn't have Gone with the Wind in mind making Casino. The way it very elaborately delves into this world, shows you the process, shows you over a long period of time it's slow rot until it's left nothing but a husk of what it used to be. And also an ending that says, well, it's not gonna get better, it's just going to change into something more squeaky clean on the surface, but just as dark and destructive in the interior, the same way Gone with the Wind ends with, well, Scarlett's not actually going to make things better for herself. She's just like the South, receding into this fantasy notion of a happy ending. Maybe doing some Pepe Sylvia connecting of the dots that aren't there, but I think Casino, it's Marty. I mean, most of his movies should end up being in this registry. I think Casino is kind of pretty good if you were had like 12 hours to devote to a double feature. Gone with the Wind and Casino, I think, would be interesting parallels to each other.
I wish you could see the grin on my face right now, because I in doing this show, I think there's nothing I enjoy more than when I'm following you and I'm listening to the description, I'm listening to the lead up, and I'm almost certain I know where it's going, and that it veers completely in another direction, and I'm completely off guard. And that's great. I love that.
Thank you for listening, and thanks to Justin and Lupita for joining us. You can follow them on social media. Justin is at JustJustin42, and Lupita is Pita_bread, Pita with 2 A's. You can also follow our co-hosts on social media as well. You can find Mike at NKOAS and Tom at RagingBull1990. And you can follow me on social media as well at Theatricality with a K. While you're there, be sure to follow the show on Twitter and Instagram at YMO Podcast. If you like what you heard, don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. If you know some friends who might like the show, tell them about it. And if you have someone you think would make a great guest for an upcoming film, tell us about it at yourmissingoutpodcast@gmail.com. Thanks again for listening, and we'll see you again next time.